mad cause I'm making my moves, yeah. I know they hate, they got nothing to do. I know they hate when I run with my crew. Watch them all hate when I'm breaking the news.
Hello! Hi! Hi, guys! How are we doing today? So, today is going to be the last stream of 2022. Because tomorrow I have plans. But today I wanted to read the next chapter of The Stars and Their Children, chapter 25. There's 29 chapters in this story, so that means we're getting pretty close to the end. Oh boy. I mean, well, there's going to be 29 chapters. So far there's only 26, but God, it doesn't feel like I've been like reading this story for that long, but didn't I start reading this it was sometime before August, because I know I started reading this in the OG setup, which is this setup, to be fair, but still. I want to say sometime in July, like when it first got, like when the first chapter got published. Roughly. Okay, let's get started then, shall we? But before I do, as always, if you enjoy this content, be sure to drop a follow, and if you want to see me play Omori, you can subscribe, help out a broke college student get their payout faster. Yeah, I think, I'm not gonna go into the logistics of it. We're here for some reading, and that's exactly what we're gonna do. So, in the last chapter, they ended it by trying to plan an escape from Zephyr's 4. Bones and the Bees is written by... The Stars and Their Children is written by Bones and the Bees. In case you don't know who that is, you may be more familiar with her other work, or she has a lot of works, but her most popular one is Tommy and Its Clinic for Supervillains, that houses the character Siren, that a lot of people on Twitter know as Siren. Wilbur Soot's villain Sona. Hi, Makia. Happy almost New Year? Thank you, you too. I'm not doing a stream tomorrow because I have plans with IRL. With an IRL. I was gonna say with IRLs, but then my brain was like, wait, no, it's only one. And so it just said IRL, and that's it. Hope you're doing well, you too. Hard to believe we're really close to finishing this. Alright. Chapter 25. Wait, 2022 went by so fast for real. It really did. Chapter 25. Oil on Troubled Waters. Summary. In order to escape from Zephyr's 4, Wilbur and Tommy need a plan. Note, I actually had to split this chapter in two because it was almost 17k words long. Excuse me. This is a really fun chapter, so I hope you guys enjoy it. Smile. Oh god. Hold on to your tissues. We're about to cry. The next day, Wilbur found himself walking down the familiar halls of the palace, his conversation with Tommy from the night before echoing in his ears. Okay, first off, we need to find out where our shuttle is. Wilbur had whispered to Tommy in the dark shadows of his room. Before they could figure out anything else, they needed to know they had a way off the planet in the first place. While they could hypothetically steal an Antarctic shuttle, considering Wilbur's already weak flying skills, it would be more ideal if he could stick with what he knew. When they arrived on Zephyrus 4 all those months ago, their shuttle had been left in the hangar, and Wilbur presumed it had been put into storage. But he didn't know that for sure. For all he knew, the whole thing could have been dismantled for scraps. It wasn't likely, but either way, Wilbur had to find out what happened to it. However, if he asked about his shuttle out of the blue after so much time had passed, that would definitely raise suspicion. For the first time since they got here, he and Tommy had the upper hand on Phil and Techno, and he intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. Which meant Wilbur had to find another way to find out what happened to his shuttle, and there was one person he could ask about it. He just had to figure out if they were trustworthy or not. Although Wilbur hadn't told Jack where they were going, he knew it wouldn't be long before his guard figured out where he was taking them. He watched Jack out of the corner of his eye, as if he could read his mind if he stared at him for long enough. Jack suspected something. That much was obvious by the way he kept frowning at Wilbur. He knew it had been a risk to stage that fight in front of him the morning before, and his suspicions were quickly being proven right. Because Wilbur's past honesty with Jack had given him the tools to read him like few other people in the palace could. He could see it in Jack's mismatched brown and blue gaze. There was a silent question there. A puzzle he couldn't figure out every time he caught Wilbur's eye. But he wasn't asking. That was the thing about Jack. He never pushed for information. And that was exactly why Wilbur was holding out hope he might be able to still call Jack a friend. Wait, Will, are we going up to the... Yes. Wilbur cut Jack off as he started on the stairs. I hope you don't mind, but you know how the cold air helps me sometimes. Jack's eyes widened in understanding. Yeah, of course, man. Let's go. From there, Jack took the lead. He led Wilbur up the flight of stairs into the small closet, opening it with a quick scan. Then, the two made their way up the spiral steps to the trapdoor, and soon enough, Wilbur was being blasted with ice-cold wind as he and Jack settled into their usual spots on the balcony. Wilbur wasn't sure if it was his imagination, but it almost felt colder than usual up there. The wind cut right through his coat, icy claws seeping deep into his bones and sending a chill up his spine. Still, the cold brought with it that frigid clarity he needed so badly. The wind bit at his cheeks as he tried to soothe the pounding of his heart. And Jack, as always, waited for him to speak first. This was going to be a difficult conversation to have. If it went wrong, their plan would be ruined before it even started. But he and Tommy had to get off this planet. If they didn't, they were both going to lose their minds, and this wasn't something they could do without help. Wilbur just had to hope his instinct about Jack was right. Do you still purposefully fuck up your reports to Puffy about what I'm doing? Wilbur asked after several minutes of silence, his words almost being carried away by the howling wind. Jack stiffened, clearly not expecting Wilbur to bring that up of all things. She stopped asking for those ages ago, actually. Wait, what? Why? At this, Jack shrugged. I don't know. She just said she'd been told it wasn't necessary anymore. Wilbur frowned. Hold on, my pencil dropped. Wilbur frowned. Do you think it's because she suspected you were giving her bad information on purpose? I don't think so. I wasn't stupid about it. I made the report sound decent. I just wouldn't mention anything they didn't already know. Jack shifted, resting one arm on his knee, before furrowing his brows. Why are you asking about this when you haven't brought it up in months? The music seems very loud in my ears. I'm gonna turn it down. There we go. If the music is too quiet on your end, let me know. I can fix that. Alright. Wilbur was going to have to watch his words very carefully here. Are we actually friends, Jack? He asked instead of answering his question. Because I've said we're friends, and you seem to agree with that. But I don't get why. Jack blinked. Fuck do you mean by that? I mean, I don't understand why you'd want to be friends with me. Wilbur pushed, straightening up against the wall. I don't bring anything to the table here. You spend more time keeping me from having a goddamn panic attack than anything else, and I just don't get why you'd give enough of a shit about me to literally lie to your superiors on my behalf. There was a moment of silence as Jack processed what he'd said. Then, his frown deepened. Are you asking me this because you're having another one of your I'm a terrible fucking person spirals? Or are you asking me about this because you don't think I'm actually your friend? Jack asked, something tight entering his voice. Wilbur clenched his jaw. It's not a pity thing, if that's what you mean. A beat passed as Jack nodded at this, bringing a hand up to rub at his jaw as anger flashed in his eyes. You know, you have a lot of fucking nerve, Jack finally said, eyes fixed on the city's skyline. I've never pushed you to talk to me. I never asked you questions I thought you might not trust me enough to answer. You said I was your friend, and I've done everything in my goddamn power to make sure I live up to that, because, guess what? Guards like me aren't supposed to have friends. We're supposed to be invisible to royals. He paused, turning to meet Wilbur's eyes. You want to know why I'm your friend? Because I wasn't invisible to you, and that fucking meant something to me. Is that a good enough answer to you? Wincing, Wilbur did his best to school his expression into something more neutral, but it was difficult when Jack was scowling at him like that. Look, the concept of friends is a little difficult for me, considering I've been betrayed by multiple people who have told me they're my friend, Wilbur explained, wrapping his arms around himself. I need to know who I can trust here. The frown on Jack's face faded, but his eyes didn't soften as the seconds ticked on. Will, you clearly have something on your mind you want to talk to me about. But if you don't trust me, then don't tell me what it is. Because the thing is, if I get asked what's going on with you, I'm not gonna rat you out. I'm gonna say you don't tell me shit. But that's just coming out of my mouth. Like you said, we don't have a reason to be friends. I get that you don't have a reason to trust me, but I'm not going to jump through hoops or whatever to prove myself. Either you tell me, or you don't. I don't care either way. And that's what made Wilbur's decision right then and there. Jack wasn't asking for information. He genuinely didn't seem to care whether or not Wilbur confided in him. In a situation like this, a spy would almost certainly make promises like, of course you can trust me, or I could have ratted you out so many times already and I didn't, so why would I do it now? that wasn't what Jack was doing. He put it in the simplest terms possible. They didn't have a reason to be friends, but they were. He wasn't going to try and prove himself as trustworthy to Wilbur because he wasn't asking Wilbur to confide in him. Wilbur could be wrong about this, but his gut instinct was back, and it was telling him to trust Jack. He had ignored his instincts with Rambu before, and now he was paying the price for it. He wasn't going to ignore them again. Rambu's a spy. Wilbur blurted out after nearly a minute of silence. Jack's eyes went wide. Excuse me, what? I overheard him talking to Techno the other night. He's been reporting all of his conversations with me and Tommy to Techno and Phil, presumably ever since we got here. Wilbur explained, the words spilling out of him in a rush. I'd been suspicious of him from the start, but Tommy kept telling me I was being overly paranoid, and after a while I started believing him. But Rambu's a fucking liar, and that's why I've been acting so weird these past 2 days. There was a moment of silence as Jack gaped at him, shock written across his face. Then, it twisted into a scowl. What a fucking prick! He exclaimed, slamming his hands down on the ground. I thought he and Theseus were best friends. I always see the two of them running around whispering to each other and shit. Tommy thought they were best friends too, but we heard Techno say he ordered Rambu to try and befriend both of us, Wilbur said, slumping back against the wall as a crushing weight was lifted off his shoulders. At this, Jack paused. You and Theseus are talking again? Wilbur huffed. Yup. That fight you heard us having yesterday morning was staged. I didn't know if I could trust you, and we don't want Phil and Techno to find out we're talking again because they'll make us move forward with the negotiations. For a moment, Jack stared at him. Then, he snorted and fell back against the opposite wall, shaking his head. I knew there was something weird with that fight. I couldn't hear what you two were saying through the door, but after Theseus stormed out and you ran after him, I could just tell there was more going on than what you were telling me. How could you tell? Wilbur asked, feeling the hair on the back of his neck rise up. Not sure how to explain it, but when you two first had your fight, and any time he got brought up after that, you had this look in your eyes, Jack explained. I'd almost say it was like you were empty. Just like something wasn't there, you know? But after that fight you two had yesterday morning, I noticed the emptiness wasn't there anymore. That's good to know, Wilbur murmured, frowning at his hands. Something to work on, I suppose. A few moments ticked by. The cold air was really starting to dig into Wilbur's skin at this point, and he knew they'd have to go back inside soon before he lost all feeling in his hands. There's a reason I'm telling you about this, Jack, Wilbur then said, shoving his hands back into his pockets. Me and Tommy both agree that because of this Rambu situation, we don't know if we can trust anything Phil and Techno have told us up to this point. Yeah, that's understandable. They've been spying on you this whole fucking time. I'd be pissed too. Jack nodded. Wilbur mirrored Jack's nodding, eyes drifting back to the skyline again. Yeah, we just don't know. He tapped his foot nervously against the stone, the sound jarring against the howling wind. That's why we need to leave. Jack's response was immediate. What? We need to leave, Wilbur repeated, now avoiding Jack's wide-eyed look. Not permanently or anything, but we can't fucking breathe here, Jack. Neither of us. We can only pretend to still be fighting for so long, but we don't know what we want to do with the negotiations right now. And having Phil and Techno looming over us and not being able to tell what's true and what's fake. He cut himself off with a shaky breath, trying to steady himself. I feel like my head is exploding. I can't fucking think inside this goddamn palace, so we have to get off this planet. At least for a bit. Where would you guys even go? Jack asked, still gaping at him. I don't know. Badlands, maybe? They're only allied with the Empire, not part of it, so they can't technically be forced to hand us back over. There was the other matter of what reason they could give the Badlands to not hand them over to Phil and Techno, but he would cross that bridge when they got to it. If not them, maybe some unaffiliated outer sector planet, somewhere no one would find us, just so we could get some time to think things through. Well, but that's fucking insane, Jack told him, pushing him to his knees. SMP, we won't let SMP find us, Wilbur said, cutting him off. I know what you're going to say, and I know it's a stupid plan, but you don't get it. We have to get off this planet, or else we're both going to lose our minds. Jack considered this for a moment. He clenched his jaw, worry dancing in his eyes as he glanced between Wilbur and the trap door leading back into the palace. Then, Jack let out a deep sigh and looked back at Wilbur's face. There's a reason you're telling me this. Wilbur nodded. We need your help. Will, I don't know. You said you're my friend, right? Wilbur asked, raising an eyebrow at him. Because if you're really my friend, if you actually care about me as a person and not just as a political figure, you would help me. Jack's brows furrowed. That's not fair. Swallowing down the lump in his throat, Wilbur pushed off the wall and made his way over to Jack's side of the balcony. He placed his hands on Jack's shoulders, looking straight into his eyes as he took another breath to steady his voice. Jack, I'm begging you. I need your help on this, Wilbur pleaded. Please, you're the only person in this entire fucking palace I trust besides Tommy. Don't make me regret that. 1 second passed, and another. Then, fuck me, Jack muttered, shaking his head before meeting Wilbur's eyes again. Fine, what do you need from me? Relief flooded over Wilbur like warm tropical waters. It soothed the chill that had settled deep into his bones, and made him forget about the way his fingers were starting to turn blue. Right now, I just need some information, Wilbur explained, smiling as his pounding heart began to slow. The shuttle me and Tommy came here in. It got left in the hangar the day we were brought to the palace. Do you know where it is? A few minutes later, Wilbur and Jack were back inside the palace, and Wilbur's hands tingled as the warmth flooded back into them. Jack was grim-faced as he led Wilbur down the familiar halls, wearing the kind of solemnity one would see leading someone to an execution. In a way, Wilbur figured that's what Jack must have been thinking right then. That he was going to help get Wilbur and Tommy killed. Maybe there was a seed of guilt sitting like a rock in Wilbur's chest because he knew he hadn't been fair to Jack during that conversation. But it was the only way he could think to convince him. Wilbur knew how risky a move like this was, but his mind was a raging storm, and there was only one thing he could focus on to keep himself sane: getting out. Thanks to Jack, Wilbur now knew that their shuttle had been put into long-term storage in the hangar. It was nearly impossible to access it where it was now, but it was still there. That meant Wilbur just had to find a way to get it taken out of long-term storage, which led him to the second part of his plan for the day. They stopped in front of the familiar door, anxiety crawling up Wilbur's throat as he thought about how he was going to pull this off. But then again, he felt the same way about Jack, and while Jack could still betray them, Wilbur's instincts were telling him that wasn't going to happen. He just had to hope for the best. Lifting a hand, Wilbur knocked on the metal door. There was some shuffling behind it, along with some low curses, before it hissed open to reveal a very tired-looking Quackity. Orpheus? Quackity's voice was rough with sleep, and his dark hair was sticking up in every direction. Despite the fact that it was midday, it seemed like he'd just woken up. What the fuck are you doing here? We need to talk, Wilbur said, placing a hand on the doorway. Can I come in? Pausing, Quackity blinked a few times, as if trying to wake himself up. He glanced past Wilbur to see Jack standing off to the side, purposefully looking the other way. Then, his eyes settled back on Wilbur. Fine, come in, he agreed, stepping out of the doorway. Looking over his shoulder, Wilbur shared a nod with Jack before stepping into Quackity's room. The door hissed as it shut behind him. Quackity dragged a hand down his face as he shuffled inside, limbs sluggish with the remnants of sleep. His room didn't look any different from the last time Wilbur had seen it. Boxes were still shoved into the corner. The desk was still littered with a myriad of random objects, the only difference being that there was even more stuff than last time. More jewelry, more boxes, more liquor bottles. Business seems to be doing well, Wilbur commented as he wandered over to the couch, not sitting on it but leaning against the arm. Quackity, who was leaning against his desk, narrowed his eyes. You didn't come in here to ask me about my work. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't hostile either. In fact, Quackity's entire demeanor was far less aggressive than it had been during the past interactions. Right now, there was that same hesitancy in his eyes he had when he found out Wilbur was staying in the personal wing, like he was on guard. No, I didn't, Wilbur answered honestly, folding his arms over his chest. I actually have a proposition for you. Quackity raised an eyebrow. Well, I'm flattered, but even if you are a pretty face, I have a rule not to get involved with politicians. Wilbur snorted at the joke, some of his anxiety ebbing away. I meant a business proposition. He paused, a smirk flickering over his face. This time. At this, Quackity rolled his eyes. Don't get your hopes up. Any kind of proposition, business or otherwise, isn't something I agree to easily. What if the business proposition comes with the promise of Blazophane? Wilbur asked coolly. More Blazophane than you'd ever see in your entire lifetime otherwise. That seemed to strike a chord. Quackity's smirk fell, something far more serious taking over his face as he mirrored Wilbur's pose, crossing his arms over his chest. His tattoos rippled in the low light of the bedroom, feathers rustling like they were agitated. I'd imagine any business that could get me, that would be something pretty dangerous, Quackity said, looking Wilbur up and down. Wilbur hummed. It won't be dangerous as long as certain parties don't find out where we arranged this, because if they do, not only will we both be at risk, but I'll personally ensure you never get your hands on another vial of Blazophane for as long as you live. Drink break. A long silence stretched between them, Wilbur not breaking Quackity's gaze as the veiled threat hung in the air. Unlike unlike any kind of physical threat, Wilbur's threat was fully plausible. Whether Tommy retained control of Eldingfeger, or Phil and Techno took it for themselves, either way, Wilbur was in a position to keep at least some level of influence over who got their hands on Blazophane. The coat on his shoulders proved this, and Quackity knew it. By certain parties, you mean Phil and Techno, don't you? He asked after nearly 2 minutes. And Rombu, Wilbur added. Another eyebrow raise. Look, I'm a man of confidentiality as long as there's money in it for me. And Blazophane would get me a lot of money. So I'm not going to go out of my way to screw myself out of that for no good reason. Wilbur nodded, the tightness in his chest easing somewhat. All right. He paused, taking a breath to steady himself. It was time for the second big risk of the day. In a way, telling Quackity what was going on held both greater and less risk than telling Jack. The greater risk was because, while Jack was his friend, Wilbur really had no clue where his relationship stood with Quackity. They'd gone from snapping at each other in the hallway, to having a physical fight, to Wilbur getting drunk off his ass and venting all his problems to him. He wasn't sure if that made them friends, enemies with a truce, or something else entirely. It makes you fuck buddies, that's what— No, I'm kidding. Listen. I'm sorry, was that too close to the mic? I put my mouth right up against it, I'm sorry. Anyway, I want to know how that sounds on stream. I'm gonna look back at stream later. Or maybe I'll forget. I forgot I had that emote. Hold on. Wait, what is that emote? I forgot I had Smadged. That's funny. Are you happy now, Slash? Yes, very much so. Anyway. But there was less risk as well. Because unlike with Jack, who had everything to lose and very little to gain from helping Wilbur, Quackity had a lot to gain from not snitching to Phil and Techno about the plan. He was a businessman first and foremost. And that's how Wilbur knew he wasn't going to turn down his offer of Blazophane. Despite knowing this, though, Wilbur still found his heart pounding in his chest as he opened his mouth again. Tommy and I arrived here on a shuttle from Eldingfeger. Right now, the shuttle is in long-term storage, but we need to get it back into the main hangar so we can access it. Quackity frowned, and I'm guessing there's a reason you can't just ask Philza to have it taken out of long-term storage? Folding his arms over his chest again, Wilbur fixed his eyes on the wall behind Quackity's head. Because that would raise suspicion. A beat. Raise suspicion of what exactly, Orpheus? An escape, Wilbur answered in as level of a voice as he could manage. It would raise suspicions that we might be trying to escape. Considering this for a moment, Quackity hooked his thumbs into his pockets, scar twitching as he bit the inside of his cheek. You're not a prisoner here, he then said, brows furrowing. Why would he think you're trying to escape? Quackity didn't ask if he was planning to escape. He simply asked why. Because motivations are a tricky thing to discern, Quackity, Wilbur explained. And trust, well, if you don't know what someone's motivations are, how can you trust them? I thought you didn't trust the Empire, Quackity asked, sounding smug. Wilbur clenched his jaw, dropping his eyes to the floor. I didn't. He paused. I don't. Then why are you here? If you don't give out your trust, how did it get broken? Taking a measured breath through his nose, Wilbur squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, trying to focus on the rhythms of the waves. His fingers twitched, that same anger flooding through his veins once more. Quackity was judging him, laughing at him almost. He forced himself to shove down the anger, to silence the roaring in his ears. He couldn't afford to lose an ally in Quackity so fast. Not now. Not after what he told him. I need you to put in a request for our shuttle to be pulled out of long-term storage, Wilbur said, instead of answering his question. Say that you want to salvage some spare parts for it to sell or something. Considering your occupation, I'm sure you can come up with an excuse for why you need to get your hands on Eldingvegri and engineering. At this, Quackity huffed. You say that like I can ask to steal parts from your ship and Philza will just hand it over. I'll grant permission for it if I need to. Wilbur shot back. Oh, and that won't raise any suspicions at all, Quackity drawled, sarcasm dripping from his words. Why the fuck would you let me just take parts from your ship to sell? We both know you don't need the money. I can bullshit some excuse, Wilbur snapped, his patience growing thin. Either way, that's not your concern, it's mine. I just need to know if you'll do it or not. Dragging a hand down his face, Quackity glanced between Wilbur and the wall. He mulled over the options, Wilbur practically able to see the gears turning in his mind. A minute passed. Wilbur's stomach twisted into knots. Then, you do realize that if you leave the surface of this planet, Dream will find you, and you'll die. He's not going to find us, Wilbur forced out between gritted teeth. We've escaped him once, we can do it again. You see, I want to believe you, Orpheus, but if I do this for you, then I kinda really need you not to die, Quackity told him, because if you die, not only am I not going to get any Blazophane, but Philza and Technoblade will cut my goddamn head off for helping you escape. Oh, come on, Quackity, Wilbur scoffed, shaking his head. You're a fucking smuggler. I'm sure you know how to tell a convincing lie. Tell the two of them that I said you could sell the parts for my ship, and that you didn't think anything of it. I hate to break it to you, but I'm not a complete idiot, and Philza is well aware of that. For fuck's sake, just... Wilbur cut himself off, digging his nails into his palms to try and hold himself strong against the water rushing in his ears. If this conversation was a game, then Wilbur was losing. Badly. He was trying to pit the promise of riches against Quackity's self-preservation skills, but he was falling short. If he wanted Quackity to agree, he had to convince him that he and Tommy could do this. As much as he tried to fight against it, Wilbur found himself thinking back to Phil, how he might handle a situation like this. Phil had always said Wilbur reminded him of himself. Wilbur supposed right now was as good of a time as any to see if that was true. I've sacrificed so much to keep my brother safe, Wilbur said quietly, resting his hands on the back of the couch. When Eldingvega was being invaded, we hid in a crawl space for days. We survived off of a few food bars and a pitiful amount of water. We had to stay completely silent, or else the soldiers walking right on the other side of the wall would hear us and kill us. Every hour, every minute, every fucking second, we were a single sneeze away from being found out. But we weren't. And when a window of opportunity opened up, we were forced to make a break for it. There's no way we should have made it, but we did. An ache flashed through his clenched jaw, and his eyes were cold as they lifted again to meet Quackity's. I haven't given you much reason to think I'm a very capable man. I understand that. He pushed away from the couch, closing the distance between him and Quackity. He tilted his head so they were eye to eye, and Wilbur willed himself to put as much conviction in his voice as he possibly could. Believe me when I tell you, I have my ways of ensuring mine and my brother's survival. Wilbur continued, his voice low. You don't want to find out what they are. A moment passed. Quackity gulped, and Wilbur saw fear flash through his eyes. He held out a hand between them. Do we have a deal? Seconds ticked by. The salt water was no longer burning Wilbur's throat. Now, he let it flow into his lungs without struggle. He wasn't drowning. Instead, he was part of the waves, and they were a part of him. A rough hand grasped his own. I still don't think you know what you're getting into, but fine. I'll ask about getting the shuttle out of storage today. Quackity relented as he shook his hand. Anxiety draining out of him all at once, Wilbur breathed a sigh of relief as he dropped the hand and stepped back. All right. How much do you know about shuttles? Shoving his hands back into his pockets, Quackity shrugged. A decent amount. Why? When they take the shuttle out of storage, I need you to check to make sure it's still functional, Wilbur told him. I don't think anything would have been done to it, but I want to make sure no critical parts were removed or anything like that before we try to fly out of here in it. Once you've done that, call my guard Jack, and he'll bring me to you so we can talk. Got it? Quackity nodded. Got it. I'll let you know when it's done. And that was it. He'd done it. Internally, Wilbur was reeling over the fact that he'd succeeded. He'd actually convinced Quackity to help them. If the shuttle was still intact, they might actually do this. Reality settled into Wilbur's bones like an unwelcome chill as he said his goodbyes to Quackity and left the room. The plan was put in motion. This was actually happening. They were going to leave Zephyr's 4. Nervousness sparked inside of him, but he did his best to ignore it as Jack led him down the hall and back towards the personal wing. His eyes skimmed the arched ceilings and concrete pillars, wondering if this was the last time he'd ever see them in the daylight. How long would it take for Quackity to get the shuttle? Hours? Days? Part of him hoped it would only take a few hours. The other part of him wanted it to be delayed for as long as possible. Footsteps echoed off the wall. Too many for just his and Jack's shoes. He didn't register the reason for that until it was too late, though, and turned a corner only to find a jolt of electricity running through him. There was a flash of pink, and Wilbur wondered if there was ever going to be a time that seeing Techno didn't send dread washing over him. But then, the second Wilbur's eyes locked onto Tommy's, he clamped his mouth shut, schooling his face into something as close to neutrality as possible. He saw Tommy do the same, furrowing his brows and looking down at the ground like he was suddenly very interested in his shoes. Beside Tommy, Rambu stiffened. He glanced between the brothers, twisting his hands in front of him like he wasn't sure if he should keep walking or not. Then, in front of the three of them, Puffy showed no reaction to Wilbur and Jack's presence. She nodded at Jack once, and slowed her pace when she noticed that Rambu, Tommy, and Techno had stopped walking, but otherwise didn't seem keen to acknowledge that anything was wrong as she kept moving down the hall. Sympathy flashed through Wilbur when he noticed Rambu nudge Tommy's shoulder. An attempt at comfort, no doubt. Tommy flinched, sparing a glance at Wilbur. To an outsider, Wilbur knew it would seem like he was the cause of Tommy's flinch. Techno stood behind Tommy, a hand hovering over his back like he was guiding him, but not trying to touch him. His expression was unreadable as his gaze flickered over Wilbur, before settling back on Tommy with something that Wilbur once would have mistaken for concern swirling in the gold. Tension crackled in the hallway, and Wilbur made no attempts to diffuse it. Instead, he hunched his own shoulders, meeting Tommy's eyes again only for a moment before forcing himself to focus on the back of Jack's head. Good, Wilbur thought to himself as he noticed Rambu wilt under the suffocating silence, still looking between the brothers. He thinks we hate each other. The run-in lasted less than a minute, but to Wilbur it felt like an hour. They passed by one another without a word between them, and soon enough, Tommy, Rambu, Techno, and Puffy were turning the corner down another hall, leaving Jack and Wilbur behind. He breathed a sigh of relief as soon as they were out of sight. Jack flashed him a knowing look, and Wilbur gave him a small nod. They both knew what the real source of tension there had been. After that, they made it back to the personal wing without issue. Foolishly, Wilbur thought that this was the end of his struggles for the day, that he would be able to go back to his room and hide there until Jack got the call from Quackity. Of course, things couldn't be that easy. While he was able to go back to his room, his respite didn't last for long. He was laying on his bed, staring at the shimmering canopy that sat between him and the ceiling, trying to undo the knots his stomach had twisted itself into when a knock at the door startled him out of his thoughts. He bolted upright. Was that Jack? Had he gotten the call from Quackity already? Wilbur didn't think it would be that fast, and dread curled itself around his shoulders as he got to his feet and padded to the door. As soon as the door slid open, all thoughts of their impending escape disappeared from Wilbur's mind, because it wasn't Jack standing in front of him like he'd expected. "Phil?" Wilbur exclaimed, furrowing his brows. "What are you doing here?" In all his time in the personal wing, Phil had never come to his room. Sure, they took meals together, and sure, Wilbur had gone to Phil's office plenty of times to talk to him. But to have Phil come to him? Something was going on. "Don't worry, mate. There's nothing wrong," Phil reassured him, no doubt seeing the fear flash over his face. "I actually have something to ask you about, but is it alright if I come in first?" Wilbur's heart was slamming against his ribs. He knew. That had to be it. But wouldn't he be angry if he knew? Phil didn't seem angry. However, Wilbur knew he could have been hiding it. Was the warmth in his eyes real? Or was he waiting to be alone with Wilbur to finally drop the act? A dozen questions raced through his head, echoing in his ears and reverberating through his skull. It was so overwhelming that all Wilbur could do in that moment was step back and gesture for Phil to come inside. Behind Phil, Wilbur saw Jack borderline gaping at the back of Phil's head. Then he caught Wilbur's eyes and silently mouthed, "What the fuck?" Wilbur almost laughed at how Jack seemed to think he had the slightest clue as to why Phil was there. Instead, though, the only thing he could do was give Jack a grim look as the door hissed shut. "Sorry to drop by without warning," Phil said as he glanced around the room, eyes lingering on the rumpled bed and boots discarded by the wall. Did I interrupt anything? Hovering by the door, Wilbur shook his head. No, I wasn't doing anything. Phil hummed, running his hand along the back of the couch before glancing back at Wilbur. You know, I'm not gonna judge you for having a messy room or anything. My bedroom would be a disaster if the servants didn't keep it tidy for me. I wasn't expecting you to drop by like this, Wilbur stammered. At this, Phil's face softened. His icy eyes were impossibly warm as he sat down on the edge of the bed. Wings splayed out on the comforter behind him before patting the spot next to him. Come sit with me. Wilbur's legs felt like wood as he shuffled over to the bed. Why didn't you just come out and say it? Was he going to try and get Wilbur to admit it himself? He sat down next to Phil, leaving a bit of space between them so their shoulders didn't brush. His heart was still racing, the salt water drowning him as he forgot how to breathe all over again. Well, to get the main reason I'm here out of the way, Wilbur sucked in a breath, bracing himself for the accusation that was about to get thrown in front of him. Got a bit of a strange request relayed to me today. Wait. Request? Wilbur forced out. Yes. Puffy informed me that Crackety has requested to see the shuttle you and your brother arrived here in, Phil explained, a crease forming between his brows. It was moved to one of our storage hangars once it was decided you'd be staying here for an extended period of time, but Quackity asked for it to be moved back into the main hangar so he could salvage it for parts. I would have denied him outright, but he told me that you gave him permission to do that. Oh. Wilbur was glad he was already sitting down, because if he wasn't, he would have collapsed right then and there. They weren't caught. Quackity hadn't ratted them out. Phil just wanted to know why the fuck Quackity was asking to see his shuttle in the first place, which was something Wilbur had already assumed he'd be asked about. Fuck. That was a heart attack he didn't need. Oh, yeah, that, Wilbur said, tension draining out of him as he fiddled with his hands in his lap. That's true. I told Quackity he could take out a few spare parts for it to sell if he needed. Immediately, Phil frowned. Well, it's your shuttle, so you're free to do what you like with it, but I don't really understand why you'd let him do something like that, especially given your history. Well, this was the time to see if Wilbur's bullshitting skills were still up to par. We've long since moved past the whole, altercation we had, he began, picking at a hangnail on his thumb. Truthfully, I'm still pretty embarrassed by the way I acted the night we drank together, so when he mentioned he'd been looking for Aldingvegorian shuttle parts, I figured I owed him for how he hasn't held that night against me in any way. Phil considered this, his frown deepening. Obvious, he said, his voice low. You forget that I've known Quackity for longer than you have. He's the kind of businessman to seize any opportunity he gets. He has plenty of enemies to show for it. Wilbur blinked. What are you saying? Phil turned to face Wilbur more, and reached out to rest a hand on his arm. You got very drunk with Quackity, and probably said some things you didn't mean to tell him. If he's holding any of that against you... Wait, are you asking if Quackity's blackmailing me? Yes, Phil answered without hesitation. I don't care what you said to him, but if he's blackmailing you, you can tell me. I'll take care of it. A shudder ran down Wilbur's spine at the way Phil said, "I'll take care of it." His tone didn't change, but the implied threat was there all the same. In a way, it was almost comforting to hear the protective threat in Phil's words. But that begged the question, why would Phil threaten Quackity for Wilbur? If Wilbur was being blackmailed into giving Quackity his shuttle so he could sell it for parts, why would Phil care? It wouldn't affect the negotiations in any way. If anything, it would take away his and Tommy's one surefire way of getting back off the planet, only giving Phil more of an advantage over them. It didn't make sense. "No," Wilbur said after a moment, shaking his head to try and silence the questions bouncing around in his mind. No, that's not what's happening at all." Doubt settled into the lines of Phil's forehead, so Wilbur quickly continued with, Seriously, he's not blackmailing me or anything. That shuttle's kind of shit anyway. It barely got us off of Eldingvega," he explained, keeping his eyes on his hands. "Besides, it's not like I have any need for it. I'm sure if we ever needed to go off planet, you'd want me and Theseus on an Antarctic ship with you, right?" At this, Phil's frown smoothed out, and Wilbur knew he'd said the right thing. "Well, I suppose you have a point," Phil murmured, nodding to himself. "We have more than enough shuttles here for our personal use, and I trust the engineering of my ships far more than I'd trust anyone else's." He paused, considering this for a moment before looking up again. "If you're sure, then I can call the hangar and tell them to grant Quackity's request." "Oh, thank fuck." "Yes, I'm sure." Phil nodded again. "All right, I'll do that today then." He went silent, looking towards the door like he was considering getting up. Instead, though, he looked back at Wilbur and sighed. "Now, onto the other thing I came here for." He moved the hand he had resting on Wilbur's arm up to his shoulder, pushing lightly so Wilbur straightened up to face him more. "You've been acting off." And just like that, the fear was back. "What?" Phil stuttered, nausea crawling up his throat. "No, I haven't." "Yes, you have," Phil said gently. "I know it's probably because of that fight you had with Theseus yesterday morning, but I just wanted to check in." Did Phil know what was going on? If he did, why wouldn't he have just said so when they were talking about the shuttle and Quackity? Was he still trying to get Wilbur to admit the plan outright? But what purpose would that serve? Was it another one of his games? Or maybe there wasn't a game. In the back of Wilbur's head, doubt over his own paranoia rose again. Maybe there wasn't a game Phil was playing here. Maybe Phil didn't have the slightest clue about his and Tommy's plan. Maybe the concern in his eyes was genuine. Wilbur thought about what he'd told Rambu the day before. That he trusted Phil. He was certain Rambu had gone and reported that to Phil as soon as their conversation ended. And if that was the case, and Phil's question was coming from a place of genuine concern, then Phil would have no reason to distrust any answer Wilbur gave him right now, because he was under the impression that Wilbur trusted him. Something like guilt pooled in his gut like oil on water, calming the rough waves, but sitting heavily inside of him all the same. His paranoia could be wrong. Even with Rambu's spying, Phil might still actually care about him. And Wilbur was lying to his face so he could run away. "I wish I could tell you everything going on in my head," Wilbur murmured, the truth slipping out without him thinking about it. "Why can't you?" Phil asked. his wing moving to wrap around Wilbur's shoulders. I can't. He couldn't ask the questions burning at the forefront of his mind. Even if he thought that Phil would give him the truth, even if he commanded Phil to tell him the truth, Wilbur wouldn't be able to ask. Wilbur didn't even know what answer he wanted. Both possibilities were terrifying in their own way. I know what that's like. When there's so much going on in your head, you don't have the slightest fucking clue how to put it into words, Phil said, his wing pushing Wilbur close to his side. That wasn't it, but Wilbur nodded like it was. His voice cracked, and he winced. I'm scared, Phil. He confessed in a whisper, the oil coating his insides and making him want to throw up. Fear had wrapped around Wilbur like an iron vice. It was there in every breath he took and every word he said. He was shaking, and he curled into Phil's side, desperate for the warmth the Ice King shouldn't have had, but did anyway. Phil only hesitated for half of a second before wrapping Wilbur in a hug. What are you afraid of? So much. There was so much for Wilbur to be afraid of. Like Phil finding out about his plan, Quackity or Jack betraying them, their escape failing, their escape succeeding, Dream and what he would do if he found them again. Finding out that everything Phil had said to him was a lie. Finding out that everything Phil had said to him was the truth. Wilbur couldn't put a voice to any of his fears, so he stayed silent. After nearly a minute, Phil hummed. You'll figure things out with Theseus soon, Phil reassured him, wings completely engulfing Wilbur. It's all going to work out, a little bit. It wasn't. But Wilbur buried his face in Phil's shoulder and let himself pretend for just a moment anyway. Eventually, Phil was called back to his duties, and Wilbur found himself alone again. He knew that he should be using this time to prepare, to come up with every step of his plan so he'd know exactly what to do the second Quackity called for Jack. For all he knew, it could be tonight, and he wanted to be ready. But Wilbur couldn't bring himself to do any of that. It was like his conversation with Phil had sucked out all the nervous energy that had been flowing through him the entire day. His mind was no longer racing with questions and worries because it was empty. He was empty. The guilt, the fear, the anger, all of it had drained away, leaving him a hollow shell. The voice in the back of his head kept asking him why he was doing this, why he was planning to leave. And he had to remind himself that it didn't matter how genuine Phil's worry seemed to be, because it was probably a lie. Hours passed. Dinner arrived at his door, and Wilbur forced himself to eat despite it tasting like chalk in his mouth because it gave him something to do. The night dragged on. Wilbur began to wonder if he should go to sleep. Surely Quackity wouldn't send the message this late. It was almost time for Jack's shift to end after all. But then, just when Wilbur was debating changing into his pajamas, there was a knock at the door. Each step to the door was a monumental effort. His limbs felt like lead, and his heart was pounding in his ears, the beats reverberating through his entire body. Before he opened it, though, he squeezed his eyes shut and silently begged the universe, not yet. The door hissed. Jack stood on the other side, once again wearing the face of a man escorting him to the gallows. Quackity wants to see you, Jack said, his shoulders rigid. Fuck. Wilbur barely processed the walk to Quackity's room. It was late. Most of the palace residents had turned in for the night, leaving the cavernous halls as silent and dark as could be. Although Wilbur had walked through these halls at night plenty of times before, it was as if he was seeing them for the very first time. Harsh lines, dark metal, cold, sharp, terrifying. At some point, these foreign halls had stopped being foreign to Wilbur. The smooth stone was familiar. The chill in the air was something to be expected. When he passed by a window, the glittering city buried deep within the ice didn't surprise him. It was comforting, almost. Wilbur forced himself to walk by it without a second glance. They arrived at Quackity's room far too quickly for Wilbur's liking. Despite the staccato rhythm his heartbeat had taken up, he didn't pause to take a breather. Instead, he walked right up to the door, forcing his wooden arm to knock before stepping back. God, I'm starting to get nervous. Jeez. A beat passed. Then, fucking finally, Quackity muttered, grabbing Wilbur's arm as soon as the door was open. The guard knows, right? Yeah, that's why I had him call you. Quackity nodded and gestured for Jack to come closer. Both of you get in here then. Don't want anyone spotting him in the hall and figuring out you're in here. With that, Quackity dragged Wilbur inside, with Jack quickly following behind. As soon as the door was shut, Quackity dropped Wilbur's arm, shoving his hands in his pockets and making his way over to his desk. First off, do either of you want a drink? They panic, not with Jack in the room. Are you fucking nuts? No, the thing is, I'm starting to have second doubts about Quackity now, too, because of Phil's conversation. Him offering a drink? I'm starting to think he might have spiked them. Although I don't know why he would do that. I'm scared. Wilbur thought back to his last drinking experience with Quackity and shook his head. Meanwhile, Jack nodded. Oh no, please, for the love of God, no. Please, I fucking need one. Jack huffed, making his way across the room to the desk. Pick your poison, Quackity said, gesturing to the row of liquor bottles behind him. Jack immediately went for the Nonin gin Wilbur had gotten far too fucked up on last time, pouring a few fingers' worth into the glass Quackity offered him before pouring some into Quackity's glass as well. Okay, I don't think it's spiked anymore, because it came straight from the bottle and both of them are drinking it. The two downed their drinks at the same time, Jack wincing at the taste while Quackity just hummed. Then, Jack straightened his shoulders and nodded at Quackity, while Quackity looked back at Wilbur. Alright, I needed that in case I get executed tonight, Quackity said, setting his glass behind him. Bro is gonna get roofied. Listen, I just got back from the hangar, and you'll be happy to hear your shuttle is ready to go whenever you are. It's not missing any pots? Wilbur asked. Quackity shook his head. Nope. I did a full rundown of everything and all systems are functional. Holy shit. Okay, Wilbur muttered, nodding to himself with wide eyes. That's what we needed. You don't seem very happy about that, Quackity commented, narrowing his eyes. No, I am. I wasn't expecting it to happen so fast, Wilbur told him, shaking himself off. A few seconds ticked by, and Wilbur glanced at the door. Shit, I shouldn't waste any time. I need to get Tommy, and then we need... Before you go... Quackity cut him off, walking over to one of the metal boxes in the corner of the room. Wilbur and Jack both watched as he dug around inside, pulling out a few smaller containers and stacking them on the coffee table behind him. Then, Quackity took out a large tote bag from the metal box. He placed the smaller, stacked containers inside and tested the weight before holding the bag out for Wilbur to take. "What is this?" Wilbur asked, slinging the bag over his shoulder and peering at the containers inside. "Just some supplies." Quackity shrugged, avoiding Wilbur's eyes as he went back to the desk to pour himself a second drink. Non-perishable food bars, some water, and a credit chip with some emergency funds on it. Wilbur furrowed his brows. "Well, Quackity, you didn't have to..." "Make out. Please, make out. Please make out in the next paragraph. Please, just please make out in the next paragraph. I'm begging." No. "The credits are a loan," Quackity said, cutting him off. "You're gonna pay me back with the Blazophane you promised. Got it?" Swallowing down the lump in his throat, Wilbur nodded. "Of course." Quackity seemed satisfied at this. He downed the second drink, wincing this time as the glass slammed on the table behind him. "No, don't people leave! I'm sorry!" "The chapter's almost over." A moment of silence hung between them. Although the bag wasn't heavy, it suddenly felt like an impossible weight for Wilbur to carry. Then, Quackity walked across the room so they were face to face again. The feather tattoos rustled in agitation as he folded his arms over his chest, looking up to meet Wilbur's eyes. "You better not fucking die, Orpheus. Kiss, 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 kiss." "Come on." Despite the anxiety thrumming through his veins, Wilbur smiled. "Oh, Quackity, come now. You can call me Wilbur." Quackity stared at him for a moment. Then, he huffed out a laugh and shook his head. "I'll call you by your personal name when you come back with my Blazophane," Quackity said, looking as though he was fighting back a smile himself. "Now get the fuck out of here." It was a challenge, one that Wilbur would gladly accept. "You'll be seeing me soon." With that, Wilbur gave Quackity one kiss. I'm kidding. It was one final wave as he and Jack left the room. Everything had been put into place. All the pieces were ready to go. This was the beginning of the end. I don't want to end it here, but I don't want to ruin my voice with the next chapter. Man, that was a good chapter. Woo! Can't wait to read the next one. But in the meantime, let's find someone to raid. I already have an idea of whom. The romantic tension was crazy. Tell me about it. I just wanted one of them to just make the first move. Let me see if they're still live. Oh, they are. Alright. We are going to be rating Mel. Soul's doing art. Yeah, some chill doodles. It's looking really good. I mean, Mel's stuff is always good, but like, go show them some love. And if you're not already following Mel, do it, because they're really cool. Next stream is probably going to be me reading the next chapter of this because... Yes! And... It's not gonna be on the 1st. Probably not. But, probably the 2nd? Most likely the 2nd. Alright. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all next time. Bye!